Hi, I'm Dave Hall with both Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Ground Zero community. We've got a number of things that we have to do. We're going to switch around a little bit. We're sorry that Dr. Frumpkin is not able to be here. He gave me a call yesterday that he's got, I guess, some fairly serious book deadlines he's trying to meet, as well as family this weekend. So he sends his apologies. Meanwhile, I thought maybe, given the wonderful conversation we just had with Ann Wright, that letting the Marshallese community come and present sort of the most impacted community around nuclear weapons anywhere on the planet, perhaps other than those around Nova Zemlya in Russia. We don't hear from them yet. So let me turn this over to Rachel Hoffman, and she can introduce the Marshallese community. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves by singing a quick song. It's our first Marshallese anthem, so I'm going to ask everyone who's Marshallese to go ahead and stand up and sing along with us.
Can you speak up a little bit?
We're going to sing our Marshallese anthem.
Maybe they could come up with it.
Yeah, come on up.
I'm not a good singer, but there you go. I just think I'm not a good singer. You give me the mic. I know. Yeah.
Compactorfree.
So just to sum the whole meaning of the song, it says, we're from the Marshall Island. We will always remember our island, where we're born, and it's where we grew up, and all of our memories and our heart is back in the island.
So this year, we're so
Speak into the microphone.
We're so happy to be here, and it's such an honor to hear from some of you, like Ann Wright. Oh my goodness, what a presentation. It's really great to learn more about some of the work that each of you are doing and the way that you're devoting your lives to this work. As we are here, as a part of the Marshallese community, we do hope to strengthen our relationship with Ground Zero. And Mary, thank you so much for just, staying in contact throughout the year since we've met. It's such a pleasure to just be a part of Ground Zero in that way. Thank you for having us here today. I'm going to introduce Dr. Robin Naroon, who will be presenting some of her research later on about how Marshallese communities are still impacted today by nuclear testing, as you are all probably aware of. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So we always like to start by acknowledging the land that we are now living on. Does anybody feel inclined to read the land acknowledgement on the screen? It's kind of dim.
It's very dim.
Can you lighten it up a little bit?
Go for it.
Thank you.
We pause to acknowledge that we reside on the traditional and occupied land of the Coast Salish people, past, present, and future. That includes, but is not limited to, Snoqualmie, Suquamish, Duwamish, Nisqually, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot. We acknowledge their connection to the region, pay respect to Coast Salish elders past and present, and stand in solidarity through their struggles with continued systemic oppression. We commit to caring for the land and water and center equity at the core of our unlearning. We also pause to recognize and acknowledge the labor upon which, upon which our country, state, and institutions are built. We remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. from the African continent, and recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge all the immigrant labor, including the voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented people who contributed to the building of the country and continue to serve within our labor force. We acknowledge all unpaid caregiving labor. We make this acknowledgement to remind ourselves that, by being here today, we strive to remedy this injustice through our beliefs and our actions.
Thank you.
Okay, so where are the Marshall Islands? I'm sure you know where they are. We're going to go ahead and take a look at this map. What I like to tell people is that Marshall Islands is a part of one sub-region of the South Pacific, and there are three main sub-regions in the South Pacific Islands, and those are Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. And so the Marshall Islands is in Micronesia, and as you can see, it's pretty far away from U.S. and it was chosen as strategic testing grounds for U.S. nuclear weapons, sort of as a way to remain secret about what they were doing. And we're pretty fortunate that a lot of our brothers and sisters who helped us navigate through trials of trying to get compensation for the devastation that our land and people faced from nuclear testing, of which some of them were from Japan. And some of you might know of that story about how there was a ship at the time of when the Bravo was detonated, and since then Japan has stuck right by us to help us advocate for our needs. And so I think that's really important to mention today, as it is the Hiroshima-Nagasaki Remembrance Weekend. I also would like to just take a pause right now just to think about all of the survivors and all of the generations of impact from nuclear war, particularly from Japan and Marshall Islands.
So the demographics of the Marshall Islands is such that there's a lot of Marshallese immigrants in the United States now.
Could you use your microphone?
Oh, so sorry. Can you hear me now? Is it working? Yeah. The demographics of Marshallese in the United States is such that between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population has actually migrated from places, to places such as Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest. under an agreement called the Compactorfree Association, also known as COFA. Approximately 1/3 of the Marshall Islands population lives in the United States now. And we've migrated here in pursuit of economic opportunity, education, and access to health care. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's also fueled by high unemployment, a stressed infrastructure, public housing, and housing shortages, which is basically poverty, right? So there's a lot of reasons for the push to come to the United States. Some of that is because of the radiation, and some of that is due to climate change. Washington State has the 3rd largest population of Marshallese people in the United States.
And so some of those areas in Washington are Everett, Federal Way, and lots of areas in South King County, Auburn, Spanaway. There's also a growing community in Oak Harbor, Bellingham, Cedar Woolley, Mount Vernon, and Spokane.
So there's a lot of background that has brought Marshallese people to Washington State. Some of that is colonization. The Marshall Islands were colonized by 4 countries, the last being the United States. There's also the environmental impact of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. Climate change has wreaked devastation on our islands. The health impacts of nuclear testing have forced people to come to the United States for healthcare. There's also a lack of disaggregated data that's really important to know. What happens is that Pacific Islanders in general are aggregated with Asian Pacific Islanders, right? And so we're a very small population that disappears in API data, Asian Pacific Islander data. And so there's a call to disaggregate data because if you lump us with API or even just Pacific Islander, our stories, our histories, our needs are quite different than other people, obviously, right? There are a huge amount of health inequities that we will talk about shortly. I also want to recommend, there's a couple of really good things is, I don't know if you've seen Collateral Damage, but by unnatural causes, and also Nuclear Savage is another movie. And there's several really good books that we can talk about shortly. But if you get an opportunity, I would highly recommend that, and also this PBS, Who Gives a Damn, and also Nuclear Savages. So the nuclear genocide occurred from 1946 to 1958, where the United States conducted 67 tests in the Marshall Islands. And if their combined explosive power was parceled evenly over that 12-year period, it would equal 1.6 Hiroshima-sized explosions per day. And this is something, it's erased in the history books, right? It's silenced, erased, normalized. This is an excellent book to read by Jack Neanderthal. We were actually told that the nuclear testing would be for the good of mankind, that it would end all wars. And so how has that worked out? These pictures, these photos of children and people are difficult to look at. They're painful to look at. But this is the reality of what happened. And it's the reality of our lives today. So one of my questions going into this was, what is the actual effect of those nuclear testings on the lives of Marshallese people today, right? You can see people observing the explosion as if it was a movie, something to be celebrated. You can see the burned children. You can see military or healthcare, and I think that really, confusing medicine with military does something to your sense of safety when receiving healthcare in the United States. I'm a nurse by training, and so I'm sensitive to the fact that medicine has been militarized also.
So what's not pictured here is the amount of cancer that people have also endured, and there's lots of different cancers that come from radiation, as some of you might know. There were some studies by Neil Patfox, who did a bunch of studies on cancers, particularly in women, and he also noticed a lot of miscarriages, and even a lot of women to this day will tell us about their miscarriages and just the deformities that would appear on their babies as they were born, who normally did not survive longer than a week or so. These babies had see-through skulls. Some of them were referred to as great babies. And as you may understand, this is like a generational ongoing effect from nuclear testing. And again, these are not images that we can put up here, and these are not, this is not easy to talk about, but it's something that we need to inform the world on, because this is what's at stake here, right? This is what we need to prevent.
And these are more photos. This is actually a photo of a Marshallese person being measured for radiation exposure in New York in the 50s. And so I think one thing that hasn't been called out is that this was medical experimentation. And so the lack of, I don't want to use that word, I would say the valid mistrust of Marshallese people towards the healthcare system is valid if you look far enough back to see all of this. Because what we often say is, oh, there's a lack of trust. Well, there's a lack of trustworthiness. So with the nuclear genocide, there was a loss of our way of life. Social norms changed. No longer could we have sustainability by, for example, fishing, right? Diet changes happened when, spam is not native to the Marshall Islands, right? It doesn't grow on our trees. There's a loss of land. Our major island, Kwajalein, which is the largest island, became the Ronald Reagan military base. And another thing that's not really spoken of quite as much is forced migration, because we're climate refugees, okay? So climate change, these are some photos of what are called king tides in the Marshall Islands. And this flooding salinates the aquifer, and so you can no longer grow plants that we used to consume. Radiation has affected our ability to eat seafood, which was a sustainable food source. So there's a loss of land and relocation to unstable or almost uninhabitable islands, which increase poverty, dependence, illness, crowding, and so forth.
Are there any measures of how much land the islands have lost because of rising sea levels?
Do you know, Rachel? I know that the island where my father came from, which is called Butaritari, had a clothesline on it where the pastor on the island had buried his coffee can full of gold, and that is now underwater. So unretrievable to us. So it's a lot of land is, I'm sure there are studies, but I'm not as familiar with that data. Is anybody else?
I don't know the numbers exactly, but as you may know, the coral atolls, they sit about 6 feet above sea level. So the coral atolls sit above sea level about 6 feet, and the sea level has risen substantially within the past 20 or so years, and that's expected to continue to rise. So And all of the islands in the Marshall Islands are low-lying. We don't have mountains. They're all completely flat islands, coral atolls sitting around the rim of inactive volcanoes. So, very vulnerable
Professor,
islands.
do you know the answer of why from 1946 to 1958, the public policy decision was not made to evacuate the entire Marshall Islands before the testing was done?
So if you go back to the images, I think 2 slides prior, you will see that there are clearly snippets that were used for Project 4.1, which is a top secret project that the government wanted to test basically the nuclear harms on human bodies. And so that is why they did not evacuate the Marshallese far away enough from the nuclear impact. And in fact,
they knew that.
it was very intentional.
They say they did not know that. And there were also American military who were exposed to radiation. So with anything very sensitive and there's different stories.
The truth
Please
is,
hold your questions until they're finished, please.
Okay, we'll take lots of questions, but Brenda, did you want to add something?
well, I
Or did
just want to say the truth is we were the guinea pig. There's nothing more than that. So we were guinea pigs. That's why they didn't tell us. They just want to use us to do whatever they want to do.
Absolutely.
To better understand it here, guys.
Thank you. Absolutely. This was not a mistake. And subsequent to this, there was, Marshallese wanted to go back to the islands, and I tried to do research. I have access to databases and understand what is the level of radiation existing now in, like, say, the Bikini Atoll. It's very unclear, and we were told that on some of the islands we could go back if we simply swept off the first inch of soil. Now, I would ask you, would you feel safe living on an island that had been radiated and you were told simply to sweep off the first inch and you would be safe to live there? Yeah. Do you want to address that? So our health outcomes, as you can imagine, are not good. When you have crowding and poverty, you have increased rates of tuberculosis. When your traditional diet changes and that you no longer can eat the fish and the crops that you used to grow, you're more susceptible to diabetes. We have a very incredibly high rate of diabetes, maybe the highest in the world. The Tohono O'odham in Arizona, indigenous people also had a loss of water rights. We've lost our water due to being relocated off of islands that had good water sources and putting on islands like Ibai that don't have as much water that you can drink. And so when you lose water and you lose your traditional diet, the result can be diabetes. We also have a lot of cancer, especially thyroid tumors. This is maybe alcoholism, might be self-medication when you're not being treated for the trauma you've endured, depression, Hansen's disease, which is also known as leprosy, as well as high rates of suicide and birth defects. And this is true in Washington State. We also have a very high incidence of COVID. So while we represent 1% of the population in Spokane, we were about 30% of the cases. Those are not cultural, those are not individual behaviors, and they are not genetics. That is structural racism, that's exposure to poverty, that's having to live in very crowded spaces, having to be an essential worker without having access to PPE. And it's also not having access to healthcare. So we'll get into that in a few minutes.
Speaking of not having access to healthcare, given that there are so many different cancers that people can get from nuclear testing effects, there's not an oncologist in the Marshall Islands. there was inadequate healthcare provided to this day. And Robin did bring up some of the challenges that we continue to face in access to healthcare.
So as I alluded to earlier, the Compactorfree Association was an agreement between 3 island nations, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. And it said that because they took our major island, Kwajalein, and made it into a military base, and I think because of the nuclear testing, they said that we could come to the United States without a visa. We would never be considered citizens, just simply nationals, okay? But we could, at that time, have access to things like healthcare and Pell Grants. We could come without health screening, without a visa. However, what happened in 1996, which was the Clinton years, when we did the Personal Work and Opportunity Reconciliation Act, I think it was called, of 1996. Remember, that was the time when we were talking about welfare, Black single mother welfare queens. And there was this big movement to drop or to abolish, practically abolish welfare, right? Well, Marshallese people were inexplicably dropped from the ability to access healthcare, okay? So from 1996 to 2020, many of our family members were unable to get any health care, which is difficult in and of itself. But if you imagine you come with very poor health baseline because of your exposure to radiation, poor food, accessibility, and radiation, it was very difficult. Maybe you can say more, Rachel?
I'm thinking of the huge wave that the U.S. had brought along with nuclear testing. Like, they didn't just bring nuclear testing, but they brought westernization with them. They removed people from islands, from their home islands, where they had been living for thousands of years, relocated them to places where they would starve and where they would have to wait 8 months for the next ship to bring food to them. There was just so much harm and so much, impact to their health, and for many of our people to come to the U.S. and expect to be taken care of and to not be is just extremely unjust. And again, this is something that we continue to battle to this day.
So in 2018, many of the people here in this room worked with our legislator to get Marshallese people reinstated onto health care. And then in 2020, it went nationwide.
There's still more work to do.
So much work. Even today, when many of our community members go to clinics with their COFA insurance card, the front desk, the healthcare systems don't recognize that because it's such a small population. They don't recognize it, and so people are turned away. And we're a kind of people that once you are told no, you won't go back and ask again. It's a lost opportunity. I did a little bit of research with my colleague, Dr. Espina, and what we wanted to know was to understand the barriers for the Ri-Majel, Marshallese people in Washington State, to access health care. The reason I wanted to know is because as a member of the Pacific Island community in Seattle, I was asked if I could help public health do outreach to Marshallese people. And while they could not seem to get a hold of Marshallese people, I found it not that difficult. And so I didn't know what the difference, I was like, what's going on here? And so I started exploring. It was a small sample size, it was 12. And we used the interpreter for some parts of it. We interviewed healthcare providers and advocates also. We did content analysis, and our first level was in vivo coding, because I was very worried about subjectivity and my bias, right? Because, yes, of course I have bias. I will own that. And then we transcribed it and uploaded it to Atlas TI. And we had the first time we coded it, we had two major findings. None of this will be surprising. The first one was healthcare access and equity was a problem. There were ongoing effects of radiation, unsurprisingly. There was repeated denial of service. Like, for example, when you go to show your COFA card, this was actually before the COFA card, but often we would go, even my cousin Brenda here tells me about taking people to the doctor and being refused because there was no insurance. So we did use, we're often asked, why do we use the emergency room for chronic disease? Well, there's a reason, EMTALA is a thing. So there's a lack of healthcare insurance, there's a lack of interpretation, and there's poverty. So there's a lot of lack of resources, right? Very easy, understandable, right? The other major finding with that first level of coding those interviews is that there's a lot of historical trauma and embodiment. So there's a lot of early mortality. People die young in our community, both from diabetes, renal disease resulting from diabetes, and from cancer. There's a lack of knowledge about Marshallese people. People don't know when you go tell people that you're Marshallese, as a little girl I said, people say, you're Martian? It was painful. It's horrible, and I feel like it's still like that. There's structural discrimination by the policies that were enacted by the United States. There's a feeling of sadness and despair that was quite obvious, and there's also a shyness and humility. We will ask you once for help, but no more. And there's also kind of a sense of cannot, will not, and like, we're just gonna accept this because to fight against that system it's better to put our energy elsewhere. Our secondary analysis was abductive coding, where we used both inductive and deductive coding, and we found that there was there's several other findings. I haven't written this up yet, but there's biopower, slow violence, and survivance. So I don't know if you're familiar with these terms. I'll be really quick, but biopower is the socially constructed power over life. And that's literally what it was, to determine who lives and who dies. Kissinger said there's only 90,000 of them anyhow who gives a damn in the 50s. Biopower is state sanctioned, obviously was, and distinguishing groups of people as worthy and unworthy is prevalent in everyday humanist modern political systems. And I'm sure you could name other areas of biopower in our country right now. So bios is sort of you're of worth, and Zoe is you're unworthy of life or rights. And clearly I saw that in what happened in the Marshall Islands. The next one, and I apologize, it doesn't usually come out this dark, but is slow violence. And one of my participants actually said to me, and this struck me, it just absolutely struck me. She said, they are just killing us slowly. And Slow Violence was written by Rob Nixon in 2011, and he says, so excuse the academese, but he says attritional catastrophes that overspill clear boundaries in time and space are marked above all by displacements, temporal, geographical, rhetorical, and technological displacements that simplify violence and underestimate in advance and in retrospect the human and environmental costs. Such displacements smooth the way for amnesia as places rendered irretrievable to those who once inhabited them, places that ordinarily pass unmourned in the corporate media, places like the Marshall Islands. And so when I read this, I was gobsmacked, especially when one of my participants said to me, they are just killing us slowly. So slow violence is that. You have the initial violence and it ripples out from that time over time and space, right? The island republic was still in part governed by an irradiated past well into the 1980s, well into the, current time. Its history of nuclear colonialism, long forgotten by the colonizers, was still delivering into the world jellyfish babies. Headless, eyeless, limbless, human infants who would live for just a few hours. It's page 7, Nixon. So when I found that after I did my interviews, and one of the participants said to me, "They are just killing us slowly." Can you imagine? I don't know if it was shock or grief that I felt most, but it hits hard. Survivance. This is a picture of my ancestors right here. Let's see if I can make it point. Oh, I don't know. But this on the right-hand side are my ancestors. And Brenda, you might even be able to tell me who they are because I've forgotten. No, not to put you on the spot, dear.
Yes, you just put me on the spot.
I did. I have to put Brenda on the spot every once in a while.
Oh, she went back when I have no idea who are those.
Okay.
They're part. Me and her
We're cousins.
cousins. Our great grandfather was from Germany, so he came and took one of the island in there. But I'm not really familiar with this picture. The other,
I thought you might be.
yeah.
You're not going to tell the story of the grandmothers right now.
I'll leave that for you to tell, because that would be good.
So when I met Brenda, we just discovered we have this same great-great-great-grandfather. And her great-great-great-grandmother was married to him. But her name, your great-great-great-grandmother's name was, what was your, oh.
Ask her. She's one of your cousins you haven't met.
But that great,
So,
Likamado.
Ito Vicky.
And then, but when she passed away, my great-great-great-grandmother married, so, and her name was Likamju. So, we are actually cousins, like many decades back. Anyhow, I show you this. This is Harold Wiesenor, who's an indigenous scholar, and he says survivance is a combination of survival and resistance, and that's what I see in my community. These are climate justice warriors, and I love this picture of our young people being uncolonized in our traditional garb, unlike this where we are colonized and placed in the colonizer's clothes. So survivance is an active sense of presence, the continuation of Native stories, not a mere reaction or survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. Simply, survivance is survival plus resistance. And when I look at, what I want you to walk away from this knowing is that when I look at my community here and the things that my community has not only survived, but come through very gracefully, that I think we would all do well to listen to our community and listen to the indigenous folks of the world who maybe know how to treat the earth in a way that's not harmful, who know how to not colonize, imperialize, and to live lives with grace, full of well-being and agency. I've seen my community right here. Brenda, who's testified in Olympia for COFA insurance. And so that's what I want you to leave with, is thinking, how do we listen to the indigenous people, the people who have been, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I absolutely want us to hear that the people who have been marginalized the most, not only Marshallese, but all indigenous people, all people who have been marginalized are the people we should listen to. And I'd like to turn it over to my cousin.
Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here today. And also to listen to Han, you really inspire me. It's like, that was a good story. But I brought two of they're also related to me. They're my cousin. That's my cousin. That's my cousin. That's how tiny our islands are. But for real. So I brought them because they are not from the island that were affected by the nuclear, which is known to U.S., like Guinea, Ronglap, and those. They are not from those islands. But my cousin over here, she's here in Washington for health care, to seek health care because she had thyroid. And I'm sorry I have to say this, but yeah, this is the reality. And her parents, they were also from one of the islands that it was really far away from where they had that. But her parents died young, also from cancer. So that's one thing I also want to let everyone know, that they always say there's only 4 islands. With how big the nuclear was, there's only 4 islands that is affected, not the rest of the Marshall Islands. So our island is mostly water, and we eat food from the earth. So imagine, with the current of the water say, oh, we're not going that direction because we have the contaminated. Or the fishes, let's say the fishes like, we're not going to go that far because we have to be over here. No. So this is what I'm trying to understand. How could they say only these 4 islands when we all share the water or the ocean? So this is one of the things, and I'm thankful that 2018 Italy signed the bill that we can have a health care, which was COFA health care. And this state funded some money for the people from the COFA to have health care. And then when we went to DC to ask for more, and they brought back the Medicaid, the COFA, they removed us from the COFA healthcare and took us to Medicaid. But then not all over the state. We are not over the United States. Washington, we are so lucky because we can be on Medicaid and we can get help with our health. But all the other states that they don't have those, the people from the Marshall Islands, they don't have health coverage. So that's one thing that we're working on. And with our people over here in Washington, we're fortunate that we have it, but we still really need to learn how to use it, because like they were mentioned earlier, once you've been turned away, we will never come back. We'll just stay sick until we're really sick and go to the emergency room. That's when we will go. But we'll just stay home and be sick because we were turned down once. So I'm happy that public health chose me to be one of the person to enroll people for our health care and educate them more about the use it. And I'm happy that I'm here to share all this with you. Thank you. Come welcome.
First of all, I want to recognize God in this afternoon. Thank you for including our Marshallese community on this day that is really important to us. Thank you for including our Marshallese community on this important event. As they were saying earlier, that only 4 atolls were impacted by nuclear testing. My parents were born in 1930s. My father passed away when he was 57, and today I am 57. He had thyroid and cancer combined. My mom was a nurse in the Marshall Islands, and when she was in Hawaii to receive health care, she died when she was 67. And the doctors told us that she had cancer all over her body. And that's all I wanted to share with you guys.
Lastly, we'd just like to thank you for having us here and for all the work you do. It's incredibly important work that you might not always be thanked for, but it is incredibly important, and we are so grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Great job. Thank you to the Marshall community for joining us today. I'm not sure that we're in a position to apologize to you on behalf of the United States government, but we do that for what that's worth. And we do work with you. We do work with you for trying to bring your ability to have some reasonable health care here in the state of Washington. Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility has been working with you and you with us about this. We thank you for your heart, for being willing to speak up, for bringing your story to us. And I also want the Peace Walkers have just arrived, okay? And they're down by the Peace Pagoda. So we want to go and welcome them. We will get together again at 2 o'clock and we'll have a conversation at that time for sort of pulling this all together. We're trying to figure out sort of what do we want as a going forward message from this gathering to our power brokers, to the folks that actually have control over these decisions. Let me just give Sean a brief shot at the microphone here, and then a brief announcement. Sean Arendt is the organizer for Citizens for Social Responsibility. He was with us in organizing this weekend.
Hey, folks. I just wanted to, well, what I want to ask of all of you is there's a bill called the Impact Fairness Act that we're trying to get Washington's delegation to co-sponsor. I'm happy to say that Adam Smith recently signed on. This bill would provide the federal benefits to the Marshallese and COFID nations that they deserve. So if there's one thing you can get out of today, please contact your member of Congress, ask them to co-sponsor the Impact Fairness Act.
And then Joanne, here you go.
If I could just put a PS on the Marshallese presentation, I think you probably all know that the Marshallese were the ones that went to the World Court and got the World Court definition about the use of nuclear weapons. It was a Washingtonian lawyer, John Burroughs, who was their advocate. And so I think Washington has its piece. Also, Glenn Anderson has interviewed Jack I just forgot his last name, the author of the, For the Good of Mankind. So it's on, Glenn, his interview of that author is on his website in case you're linked into, but that's not why I'm here. Why I'm here is because there's an amazing Rotary group. It's a satellite group, and their focus is on nuclear weapons, specifically. And they're trying to get the International Rotary to take on the TPNW, which is very exciting. At the last meeting, Ira Helfand, whom you might know because he's the head of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, he came out with an amazing announcement. He said, medical journals usually pride themselves on never carrying anybody else's articles. You know, every medical journal has to be, you know, its own piece. Well, 11 editors from a range of the medical journals got together and came out with an editorial in the next issue of all the journals, all the medical journals, 100 of them worldwide, are carrying the very same editorial, and that is to abolish nuclear weapons, and trying to ask the physicians to take a lead in this. So Sean will have copies of that article for you tomorrow, and what they're asking people to do is to let this know this is a worldwide event. This is a real worldwide event. The fact that all these medical journals, and they're the leading medical journals in the United States, it's the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, the journal that's the one that my dad used to get, and Journal of the AMA, American Medical Association. But it's also the British Journal Lancelot, and then there's another one, I can't remember it, but it's in the promotional material. Anyway, they're asking us to write our own physicians and include the copy of the editorial so that they'll read it. They might just not pick up this next issue of the magazine. So to either call them or alert them, please just read this article, and could you contact your fellow people in your office, let them know about the treaty, let them know that the medical community is behind, really behind, because this is an amazing initiative coming out of the leadership of the medical community. So I'm hoping that tomorrow, when Sean is leading the letter writing, that you might take up this pitch. So I'm sorry to take up the time.
So let's head down to the Peace Pagoda. Thank you all very much. Let them know that we're going to try to make this a national